My name is Margaret Elizabeth Hayes, born Margaret Elizabeth Parker, and I came into this world on the 19th of August, in the year 1845, in Leavenworth, Kansas Territory, when Kansas was not yet a state, but only a hope and a battlefield. I am now in my 82nd year, and I have been asked to give an account of my life for those who will come after me. I will do so with a candor that would have been impossible while my husband was alive, for he has been dead these 2 years. I find that widowhood has granted me the one freedom his 45 years of marriage never allowed me, the freedom to speak honestly about what those years cost me. I regret my marriage. I have regretted it every day of my adult life. This is not a statement made lightly or in simple bitterness, although bitterness has certainly walked beside me through the decades. It is simply a fact, as plain and undeniable as the fact of my birth or the color of my eyes. I married the wrong man. I understood it within weeks of the wedding, and I spent 45 years trapped in the knowledge of that mistake, with no way to correct it. If you are to understand what I am about to reveal, you must first know what Kansas Territory was in the 1840s and 1850s, and what choices were and were not open to a young woman in that time and place. My father, Josiah Parker, brought our family to Kansas in 1854, the year the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened the territory to settlement. He was drawn by the promise of land, and by the fierce political struggle over whether Kansas would enter the Union as a free state or a slave state. My father was an abolitionist from Massachusetts, educated at Harvard, a man of strong principles and limited practical judgment. He believed that settling in Kansas was not only an economic opportunity, but also a moral mission. He brought his wife and 4 children into what was, in truth, a war zone. I was 9 years old when we arrived in Leavenworth. My older brother William was 12. My younger sister Catherine was 7, and my baby brother Henry was not yet 2. My mother, Sarah, was a woman of great strength who had not been asked her opinion about moving to Kansas, and who endured it with the quiet patience expected of wives in that period. The years from 1854 to 1861 in Kansas Territory were years of violence and political disorder. The fight over slavery created what came to be known as Bleeding Kansas. There were raids, killings, towns set on fire, and armed groups moving across the countryside. Leavenworth itself largely supported the Free State cause, but that did not make it calm. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces fought with guns and fire, and the territory was almost in a state of civil war long before the National War began. My father threw himself completely into the Free State cause. He attended meetings, wrote pamphlets, and spoke at public gatherings. He was not a violent man. He owned no weapon and would not have known how to use one. Yet he was a man of deep conviction and great stubbornness, which in that time and place could be nearly as dangerous as carrying a gun. In 1856, when I was 11, a pro-slavery militia attacked our farm, burned our barn, and threatened to hang my father if he did not stop his abolitionist activities. He refused to stop. My childhood was therefore shaped not by ordinary concerns of girlhood, but by the constant knowledge that we lived under threat. My mother kept many of our belongings packed in trunks for years, ready to flee at a moment's notice. My brother William, who was 3 years older than I, was drawn by my father into the political struggle in ways that troubled me. At 14, he was carrying messages between Free State men and attending meetings where violence was discussed and sometimes carried out. Kansas became a state in January 1861 as a free state. My father saw this as proof that all he had sacrificed was justified. 3 months later, the National War began, and William enlisted at once in a Kansas regiment. He was 19. My father did not try to stop him. He believed the war to be a sacred cause and sent his eldest son to fight with what I can only call pride. William died at Wilson's Creek in Missouri in August 1861, just 3 months after he enlisted. He was shot in the chest and died on the field. My father received the notice in September. My mother, who had already lost her infant son Henry to fever in 1859, collapsed when she heard of William's death. She took to her bed and did not truly rise from it for 3 months. My father, meanwhile, deepened his devotion to the Union cause, as though the death of his son stirred greater passion rather than grief. I was 16 in the autumn of 1861, running a household my mother could not manage, caring for a sister of 13 who was restless and wild with sorrow, and watching a father who turned personal loss into political principle without allowing himself to mourn. It was during this time that I first met Samuel Hayes. Samuel was 38, a merchant in Leavenworth, who supplied goods to the Union Army and who had grown wealthy from the wartime economy. He had been married before. His first wife had died in childbirth years earlier, and he was looking for a second marriage. He was not required to serve in the army because of his age and because his business was considered essential to the war effort. He began visiting my father in the spring of 1862, supposedly for business matters, but in truth, as became clear, to judge whether I would be a suitable wife. My father welcomed his interest. My mother, when she was strong enough to give an opinion, did not oppose it. Samuel was prosperous, respectable, and established. The fact that he was more than twice my age was not seen as a problem. Such differences were common, especially for widowers seeking new wives. I did not like Samuel Hayes. I knew it almost at once, though I could not clearly explain why. He was not openly cruel in his courtship, but neither was he kind. He spoke to me in a tone that suggested he already held authority over me, rather than wishing to win me. He discussed business and politics with my father. With me, he spoke of cooking, housekeeping, and child-rearing. He studied me as one might study livestock at a market, measuring my ability to perform the work he expected. I told my father in the summer of 1862, when I was 17, that I did not wish to marry Samuel Hayes. My father answered quickly and firmly. Samuel was an excellent match, he said. He was successful, respected, and able to provide well for me. My father had greater concerns than my feelings. He had lost a son to war, had a wife in fragile health, and another daughter to settle. He told me my duty was to marry well and stop being a burden to the household. I insisted that I did not love Samuel and could not imagine ever loving him. My father looked at me with a mix of pity and scorn and said that love was not the chief concern in marriage. Respect, social standing, and practical suitability were what truly mattered. Love, if it came at all, would grow after marriage through shared duties and shared struggles. Young women who believed they must love a man before marrying him were, in his view, foolish and romantic. My mother was slightly more gentle when I turned to her, but no more helpful. She told me marriage was a woman's fate, and that I should feel fortunate to have secured a prosperous husband. She admitted she had not loved my father when she married him either, but had learned to accept her life and find small comforts within it. She advised me to do the same. I had no support and no other path. I was 17 in Kansas Territory in 1862, where a young woman's choices were limited to marriage or remaining unmarried under her father's roof. My father made it clear that I would not be allowed to stay if I refused a proper match. By every standard that mattered in that society, Samuel Hayes was proper and suitable. We were married in November 1862. I was 17. He was 39. The ceremony was short and simple, a wartime wedding without celebration, attended only by close family and a few witnesses. I spoke my vows in a voice that did not feel like my own, and I became Mrs. Samuel Hayes with a sense of finality that felt almost like being laid into the ground. The marriage was wrong from the very first night. Samuel was not a violent man. He never struck me, never threatened physical harm, never displayed the harsh brutality some husbands of that era inflicted. Yet he was distant, critical, and constantly dismissive. He had married me to perform certain duties, to manage his home, bear his children, and present a respectable image in society. Beyond those roles, he showed no interest in me. He did not discuss serious matters with me. When he spoke to me, it was usually to give instructions or to point out faults. The meals I prepared were never quite good enough. The household accounts I kept required his steady correction. The clothes I sewed for him were acceptable, but never praised. He carried a steady air of dissatisfaction, as though I were always failing to reach a standard he never clearly explained, yet which I was always told I had not met. There was no tenderness between us, no warmth, no true companionship, only duty and the slow passing of years. Companionship. E shared the same bed because that is what married couples did, and from that arrangement came children. But there was never anything close to tenderness. He regarded the marital act as a right he owned and a duty I was required to perform properly and without needless feeling. Our first child, a son we called Samuel Jr., was born in September of 1863. I was only 18 years old. The labor was long and painful. I remained in childbirth for 2 full days, cared for by a midwife who told me plainly that I was narrow in build and that bearing children would likely never be easy for me. Samuel Sr.'s response to the birth of his son was satisfaction at having produced an heir and irritation at my slow recovery, which he described as weakness. During the next 12 years, I gave birth to 5 more children: Josiah in 1865, Mary in 1867, William in 1869, Catherine in 1871, and Sarah in 1875. Of the 6 children, 4 lived to adulthood. We lost William to a fever when he was 3 years old in 1872, and we lost Catherine to an accident when she was 5 in 1876. She fell from a wagon, struck her head, and died within hours before the doctor could even be called. Samuel's reaction to the deaths of our children was to show disappointment that I had not been more careful to prevent such tragedies, as if a mother's watchfulness could stop fever or prevent every accident. He did not comfort me in my sorrow. He did not reveal any grief of his own. If he felt any, he only observed the practical outcome. We had lost 2 children. We must be more careful with the remaining ones. I should try to bear more children to replace those who were gone. Before we continue, a brief word. I have released 14 full recordings that will never appear on YouTube. These are voices too personal and too raw to share publicly, completely unedited and with nothing removed. If you want access, the link is in the description. It is called The Lost Recordings, and getting it helps us continue making these videos. Alright, back to the story. I did not have any more children after Sarah in 1875. Whether this was because of some physical change in me or simply fortune, I cannot say, but I was thankful. Bearing and raising 6 children in 12 years had drained me in ways I do not have the words to fully explain, and the thought of continuing without end was more than I could imagine. The years from 1875 to 1900 were marked by constant domestic work and deep emotional isolation. I managed Samuel's household with skill born from necessity. I raised 4 surviving children to adulthood without help or appreciation. I maintained the image of a successful marriage because publicly admitting that I was deeply unhappy was not an option. Women in my position did not leave their husbands. Divorce was scandalous and nearly impossible for a woman without her own income. I had no family home to return to. My father had died in 1891, my mother in 1884, and my sister Catherine had married and moved to California. The daily truth of that marriage was a slow wearing down of the spirit so gradual that I could not point to a single moment when it became unbearable. It had always been unbearable from the start, but the burden increased in such small degrees that each day felt like a continuation of the one before, rather than a clear crisis demanding action. Samuel rose before sunrise and expected his breakfast prepared exactly as he preferred it. Eggs cooked to a precise texture, toast neither too light nor too dark, coffee at the correct temperature. If anything displeased him, he would remark on it, not with anger, but with tired disappointment, as though I had once again failed to meet a standard any capable wife would naturally achieve. He would then leave for his business, returning exactly at 6:30 in the evening, when dinner was expected to be waiting. Between his departure and return, I cleaned the house, prepared meals, cared for the children, kept the household accounts, sewed and repaired clothing, preserved food for winter, tended the kitchen garden, and completed the countless other duties that formed the work of a farmer's or merchant's wife in that time. Labor was never recognized as labor. It was simply what wives did, what I was meant to do, and the fact that I performed it reliably and well was not praised, but assumed. In the evenings after dinner, Samuel would sit in his chair and read the newspaper while I cleared the table and prepared the kitchen for the next day. Occasionally he would read aloud an article that interested him, not to invite discussion but to declare his opinion on the matter. He never asked for my thoughts. He never questioned how my day had been. He never spoke in a way that suggested he saw me as a person with an inner life worth recognizing. On Sundays we attended church together as a family. Samuel insisted on our attendance and our proper conduct. We were to present ourselves as respectable and devoted, which meant dressing correctly, sitting in our usual pew, listening carefully to the sermon, and exchanging polite greetings with others. After the service I became practiced in the performance of contentment. I smiled. I spoke of domestic matters and the children. I accepted compliments about my management of the household and the upbringing of our children. I never once hinted that I was anything other than a fortunate woman blessed with a successful husband and a comfortable existence. The loneliness of that performance was perhaps worse than Samuel's unkindness. I was surrounded by people, my children, my neighbors, the other women at church, and yet I could speak honestly to none of them. They believed I possessed what they had, or hoped to have, a steady marriage, financial comfort, social respect. To say otherwise would have broken every rule of the society in which I lived. Women did not complain about their husbands. Women did not confess unhappiness in marriage. Women upheld the appearance of domestic peace, even when it did not reflect reality. Over the years, I tried to adjust my thinking to make my situation more bearable. I reminded myself that many women endured worse marriages than mine. Samuel did not strike me, did not drink excessively, did not gamble away our money, did not shame me in public. These absences of open cruelty were meant to be reasons for gratitude. I told myself that my children's well-being depended on my continued endurance, that leaving Samuel or even openly acknowledging my misery would harm them more than it would help me. I wondered if perhaps I was at fault, ungrateful, too sensitive, unable to appreciate what I had. None of these thoughts changed the truth. The marriage remained what it had always been, a prison I could not flee, and a weight I could not lay aside. I was confined, aware of my confinement, and there was no remedy except endurance. As Samuel grew older, he became more difficult. He had always been critical, but in later years, he turned openly unpleasant. He complained constantly about the house, about the cost of running it, about my handling of domestic matters. He criticized our children, especially our daughters, whom he considered foolish and costly. He complained about his business, about the town, about the weather, about the condition of the nation. Nothing satisfied him. Nothing was ever enough. And I, as his wife, absorbed the daily flow of his dissatisfaction, delivered at every meal and every evening. Our children matured and left. Samuel Jr. established himself in business in Kansas City and visited rarely. Josiah married and moved to Colorado. Mary married a farmer and settled some distance from Leavenworth. Sarah, our youngest, married later than I wished and moved to Missouri. By 1900, Samuel and I were alone in a house that felt larger and emptier than when it had been filled with children. Without them, there was nothing between us but silence and bitterness. Their departures brought both relief and sorrow. Relief, because each child leaving meant one fewer witness to the quiet misery of the household. But sorrow because children, though demanding, had at least provided some space between Samuel and me, some shared purpose beyond our mutual disappointment. I sometimes wonder what they saw as they grew up in that house, what they understood of their parents' marriage. They surely heard their father's steady criticism of me. They listened as he complained about meals, about the condition of the house, about expenses. They saw me accept these remarks without protest, fulfilling my duties with steady ability, but without the warmth or happiness that might have marked a joyful home. I tried to be a kinder mother than Samuel was a father. I cannot say if I succeeded. I was not openly affectionate. I had been raised in a home where feelings were not freely expressed, and Samuel's cold nature strengthened that restraint. Still, I tried to care for them not only in material ways, but with attention to their individual personalities and needs. I listened when they spoke. I noticed what they liked and what frightened them. I attempted to create small areas of gentleness within a house that was otherwise lacking in it. Samuel treated the children with the same dismissive judgment he showed toward me. Samuel Jr., as the eldest son and carrier of his father's name, likely endured the hardest treatment. Samuel expected perfection from him and treated any failure as a personal insult. Josiah quickly learned to avoid drawing his father's notice. Mary and Sarah, as daughters, faced constant remarks about their appearance, their manners, and their domestic abilities, always reminded that they must excel in every way to satisfy a father who seemed to believe. His daughters existed primarily to reflect credit upon him rather than to live as independent souls to reflect credit upon him. They departed as soon as they were able to arrange it. Samuel Jr. at 19, Josiah at 20, Mary at 21, Sarah at 23. Each leaving was carried out with what appeared to me to be unusual speed, as if they feared that staying even a little longer might bind them forever to a household they were eager to escape. I did not blame them. I would have run as well, if running had ever been an option for me. After they were gone, I received letters from them fairly regularly, though not as often as I might have liked. The letters were dutiful instead of affectionate, careful reports of their own homes, their own children when those came, their daily concerns and responsibilities. They seldom asked about me directly, and when they did, the questions were broad and polite. "How are you managing, mother? Is your health sufficient? Is father keeping well?" I answered in the same general manner. "I am managing as best I can. My health is suitable for my age. Your father is as well as may be expected." I could not tell them the truth. What truth could I share that would not sound like complaint? And what good would complaint accomplish? They were building their own lives. They did not need the added weight of knowing that their mother had been deeply, unhappy for most of her married life. So I kept up the fiction in my letters, just as I maintained it in person, that the marriage was steady, that their father and I were passing our later years with the dignity expected of people of our age and position, that everything was as it ought to be. When they visited, which was rare, they stayed only a short time, a day or two at the most. Samuel made these visits tense with his grievances and constant criticism, and the children would leave with clear relief. After several such occasions, their visits became even less frequent. I understood and did not reproach them. Why should they expose themselves to their father's harshness when they had already freed themselves by forming their own households? Why should they observe their mother's quiet endurance when seeing it served no purpose except to involve them in something they had no power to change? News of grandchildren reached me mostly through letters. Samuel Jr. had 3, Josiah had 4, Mary had 5, Sarah had 2. I saw these grandchildren seldom, and when I did, they felt like strangers, polite but distant, uncertain how to relate to an elderly grandmother they scarcely knew, and a grandfather whose constant fault-finding made them uneasy. I should have enjoyed the happiness of grandchildren in my later years, but Samuel's temperament discouraged our children from bringing their families to our home with any regularity. One of my daughters, I will not name which, as it is not important here, wrote to me privately during those years. She had been married for some time and was experiencing difficulty in her own marriage. She asked for my counsel. She wanted to know whether marriage was always as hard as she found it, whether the loneliness and disappointment she felt were normal burdens to be borne, or signs of something more seriously wrong. I kept her letter beside me for 2 days before answering, trying to decide what I could truthfully say. I longed to tell her the reality, that my own marriage had brought me sorrow for decades, that I had spent 40 years confined in a union I regretted, that if her marriage caused her misery, she should carefully consider her choices before surrendering more years to it. But I could not bring myself to write those words. To do so would have meant admitting to her what I had never confessed to anyone. It would have shattered the appearance I had preserved throughout her childhood. It would have required me to acknowledge that I had presented to her a model of marriage that I now believed could not truly endure. Instead, I wrote a letter filled with common sayings about patience and obligation, and the usual difficulties of married life. I told her that all marriages demanded effort, that disappointment was frequent in the early years, that she should carry out her duties and trust that matters would improve with time. I sent that letter knowing it was insufficient and perhaps damaging, knowing that I was repeating the same untruths my mother's generation had given to me, knowing that I was failing my daughter just as my mother had failed me. She remained with her husband. I do not know whether my advice influenced her choice or whether other reasons guided her. I hope her marriage grew kinder, and that she found some measure of contentment. Yet I fear that I encouraged her to return to a life that might have resembled my own. That fear remains one of the regrets I carry. He retired from business in 1915 at the age of 81. I was 60 and had spent 43 years as his wife. The idea of his retirement filled me with something close to dread, because I understood at once what it would bring. His unbroken presence in the house, his continuous supervision of my daily routine, the loss of even the small liberties I had known during his hours at work. My fear proved entirely justified. Once retired, Samuel had nothing to occupy him except observing my actions and voicing his dissatisfaction. He would sit in the parlor and watch as I worked, commenting on how I cleaned, how I cooked, how I kept the household accounts. He followed me from one room to another, pointing out tea dust I had overlooked or duties not yet finished. He questioned every purchase, every choice, every moment I spent on anything that was not direct service to his comfort. The kitchen, once my own space where I could labor with some independence, became a place of constant inspection. Samuel would stand at the doorway and criticize my cooking. The vegetables were chopped too large or too small. The meat was underdone or overdone. The bread was too heavy or had not risen enough. Nothing pleased him, and his displeasure was not expressed as personal preference, but as proof of my ongoing inability to meet even simple standards. I tried to leave the house more often during those years, to visit neighbors or attend church gatherings. But Samuel objected to these outings. He insisted that I remain at home to tend to his needs, though his needs were slight and often imagined. He was not helpless. He could dress and feed himself and move about without assistance, yet after 4 decades of my constant availability, any absence of mine, however brief, was treated as neglect. During those years I began to understand why some women greeted their husbands' deaths with visible relief. I had noticed such widows before, but had not fully grasped the reason. Women who seemed to flourish after widowhood, who appeared more lively and engaged with life once their husbands were gone. In my youth, I had judged this behavior improper. By 1915, I understood it completely. Those women had been freed from prisons that outwardly resembled respectable homes. As Samuel advanced through his 80s, he developed various illnesses. The weak heart I mentioned, breathlessness, aching joints, digestive troubles. Each condition added further demands on my time. He required special meals for his stomach. He needed assistance rising from his chair. He expected continual attention to ensure he did not strain himself. Yet through all of this he remained as critical and as ungrateful as ever, with the added burden now of dependence that made his treatment of me even more trying. I would assist him with bathing, and he would complain that the water was either too warm or too cold. I would help him dress, and he would object to the way I fastened his buttons. I prepared the soft foods his teeth allowed, and he expressed regret that his meals were no longer hearty. Nothing I did contented him, and everything was carried out under his steady gaze and endless remarks. In those last years, there were nights when I lay awake calculating how long he might live. He was 83, then 84, then 85. Men of such age rarely lived many more years. Surely this could not continue much longer. Surely an end was drawing near. These thoughts were not admirable, but they were truthful, and they sustained me through what felt like endless waiting. Our children visited from time to time, yet they did not see the daily truth of our life together. They saw an aging father in decline who deserved kindness and patience. They saw me providing that care competently. They did not witness the inward toll, the slow wearing away of what remained of my spirit after more than 40 years of such treatment. I did not tell them. What purpose would it have served? They could not save me. They could not alter Samuel's character. To speak would only have given them a sorrow they were powerless to relieve. I sometimes reflect on what might have occurred had I possessed a different nature, less bound by custom, more willing to defy expectation. Could I have departed? Where would I have gone? To a child's home where I would have been an aging dependent mother instead of a dependent wife? To some charitable residence for women where I would have survived on mercy rather than on the provision my marriage secured? The obstacles were real. Yet I wonder whether I hid behind those obstacles to avoid the bravery that leaving would have demanded. By 1920, when I was 75 and Samuel 83, I had developed an emotional numbness that I believe preserved my reason in those final years. I carried out my duties mechanically. His criticisms no longer pierced me because I had heard them so many thousands of times that they had lost the power to injure. I continued in this manner, day after day, sustained not by hope, but by endurance alone. I no longer wished for anything better, because hope had become a luxury I simply could not afford. I endured one day at a time, one week after another, year following year, waiting for the only release that seemed possible, the one that would come through his death. I am not proud of these thoughts. I understand that wishing for a husband to die is not considered noble, but I am no longer concerned with appearing admirable. I care about speaking honestly, and the honest truth is that I spent the last 20 years of my marriage hoping it would end. The only respectable way it could end was through Samuel's death, and so I found myself wishing that Samuel would die. In January of 1925, he finally did. When it happened, I did not mourn the man himself. I mourned the decades of my life that his presence had consumed. He passed away in January of 1925 at the age of 80. His health had been failing for years. His heart had weakened, his breathing was strained, and his movements had grown limited. I cared for him during those final years, because that was what a wife was expected to do, though I cannot claim I did it with affection. I washed him when he could no longer wash himself. I helped him dress when his fingers cold. Not manage the buttons. I prepared soft meals when chewing became difficult for him. I carried out these duties with the same steady competence I had shown throughout our marriage, which is to say, without love, yet also without open bitterness. He was never thankful for the care. Gratitude was not part of his character. He complained about the way I looked after him. He criticized how I turned him in bed, how I arranged his pillows, how I gave him his medicines. Even when he depended on me for his most basic needs, he could not speak to me with anything close to kindness. He died quietly in his sleep on a cold winter night in January 1925. I found him the next morning when I brought his breakfast tray upstairs. At some point during the night, he had simply stopped breathing. There had been no struggle, no emergency, no call for help. He went to sleep and did not wake again, which at his age was perhaps the gentlest end one could expect. When I realized he was gone, the first feeling I experienced was not sorrow, but relief. I stood by the bed holding the tray and felt a burden lift from my shoulders, a burden I had carried so long I had almost forgotten its weight. He was dead. The marriage was finished. I was free. I placed the tray down, went downstairs, and sent for the doctor and the undertaker. I telegraphed our children. I began arranging what needed to be arranged. Through all of it, I felt nothing that could truly be called grief. I felt released. I was 79 years old. I had been married for 63 years, more than 3/4 of my entire life. For the first time since I was 17, I lived without a man's authority, without his criticism, without his constant demands. The funeral was attended by what the newspaper described as a large and respectful crowd. Samuel had been known as a successful merchant, a long-established resident of the town, a man considered important in the community. People praised his business sense, his hard work, his achievements. They told me I must feel his loss deeply after so many years of marriage. They said I had been a devoted wife and that Samuel had been fortunate to have me. They described our marriage as an example of stability and respectability. I nodded, accepted their condolences, and spoke the proper words. Yet inside I was counting the hours until everyone would leave, and I could sit alone in the house that was now mine, answerable to no one, and required to serve no one. The first months of widowhood felt like a revelation. Each morning I woke and remembered that I could shape my day as I pleased. I could cook food I preferred rather than meals Samuel demanded. I could read quietly without interruption or commentary. I could invite neighbors for tea without asking permission. I could make choices about the house, about money, about my daily routine, without considering another person's wishes. The freedom was both thrilling and unsettling. I was 79 and had never in my adult life been the main decision-maker in my own existence. For 63 years I had placed my will beneath Samuel's, and the habit of submission was so deeply rooted that sometimes I caught myself wondering what Samuel would have wanted, before remembering that his wants were no longer my concern. Gradually, and with hesitation, I began to speak more honestly about the marriage. When neighbors mentioned how much I must miss him, I would quietly say that our marriage had not been what they imagined, that Samuel had been a difficult man, and that I was managing reasonably well without him. Some were shocked by my candor. Others, especially certain older women, looked at me with a knowing expression that suggested they understood more than I was saying because they had lived similar our lives. People continued to offer sympathy. They described Samuel as a pillar of the community, a prosperous businessman, a man of standing. They repeated that I must feel his absence deeply after so many shared years. I accepted their kindness and replied as widows are expected to reply. But what I truly felt, and what I have felt in the 2 years since he died, is not loss but freedom. I do not grieve for Samuel Hayes. I cannot pretend to have loved him when I did not. I spent 45 years married to a man I did not love, a man who did not love me, who treated me more like a housekeeper than a partner, who offered little beyond complaints and commands. I raised his children, managed his home, and upheld his good name in society. In return, he gave me only the financial support that the law required of a husband. That was the full extent of his contribution. This is what I could never say while he was alive. I regret that marriage. I regret every single year, every single day, every hour of it. I regret the 17-year-old girl who had no power to refuse. I regret the woman I became at 30, at 40, at 50, still confined within it without escape. Most of all, I regret that I spent my one life, the only life I will ever have, in service to a man who offered me nothing of true worth in return. Some will argue that one should not speak ill of the dead, but I do not speak to harm him. He is beyond harm now. I speak honestly about what that marriage was, because someone should speak honestly about what marriage could mean for women of that time. It was not always companionship. It was not always partnership. Sometimes it was simply a bargain in which a woman exchanged her entire future for security and social approval, and the price of that bargain could be everything she might have become. I do not know who I might have been if I had not married Samuel Hayes. I was 17, and my future closed before I had the chance to discover my abilities beyond managing a household. I might have been a teacher. My father educated me well, and I had a gift for language. I might have been a nurse, a reformer, perhaps even a writer. Or I might have been entirely ordinary, but it would have been my own ordinary life, rather than one spent serving a man who could not offer even simple human warmth. My children do not fully know what I am saying now. They saw their father as distant and critical, but they did not witness the steady accumulation of small unkindnesses that shaped our marriage. They had their own lives and their own connections to him, and I did not burden them with my unhappiness. They believe I was a faithful wife who cared for their father until his death. In practical terms, that is true, but they do not know what it cost me. They do not know that I counted the eyes until I would be free. This is what many women of my generation could never say. We were trapped in marriages we did not choose, with men we did not love. We endured because there was no other path available. We fulfilled our duties. We raised children. We kept the house. We presented the appearance of contentment, and inside, many of us were silently screaming. I am 82 years old now. I have lived 2 years longer than Samuel, and hope to live several more. These remaining years belong to me at last. I wake each morning to a quiet house with no one to criticize me or demand anything from me. I make my own choices. I spend my time as I wish. I answer to no one. This is not the life I would have chosen at 17 if choice had been offered, but it is better than what I had, and I am grateful for it in ways I struggle to express. If I could speak to my 17-year-old self, I would tell her to refuse the marriage. Refuse it even if it means remaining unmarried in your father's home. Refuse it even if it brings poverty. Refuse it even if society disapproves. Nothing you might suffer by refusing would be worse than 45 years beside a man who treats you as less than fully human. But at 17 I could not have known this, and no one who might have understood would have told me. The women of my mother's generation were taught to accept their fate, and they taught their daughters the same lesson. We were not raised to believe we had the right to choose our own futures. We were taught that our lives were not truly ours to decide. For the past 2 years, I have spoken truths I could not speak while Samuel lived. I tell neighbors I do not miss him. I tell my children that the marriage was not what it appeared to be. I tell anyone willing to listen that duty and endurance alone are not strong enough foundations for a life, and that women deserve more than mere survival. We deserved far better than what we were given. Many people do not want to listen to this. It makes them uneasy. It questions their ideas about marriage, about the past, and about what their own parents' marriages may truly have been like. But I am now too old to worry about other people's comfort. I speak honestly because I am able to, and because I spent too many years saying only what was proper and acceptable. This is my statement. This is what it meant to live as a woman. Born in 1845, married at 17, confined for 45 years, and at last free at 79. I regret the marriage that I was forced into. I do not regret the children I carried and raised, although bringing them up under Samuel's control was far more difficult than it should have been. I do not regret that I survived, and I do not regret these closing years of my life, which are the first years of my adulthood that have truly belonged to me alone. I have been told that this testimony will be kept safe so that future generations may hear it and understand what life was like for women of my time. I hope they will listen and see how much has changed and how much truly needed to change. And I hope they will remember that behind every loyal wife and every long-lasting marriage, there may have been a woman quietly counting the days until she could finally be free.